Whenever you make a change in life, you're going away from something and you're going towards something. And a friend of mine said, just go, fly to California, go to the interviews and be present. And that, if you're ever not sure that you want to try something, that is really good advice. Just go and be present. Make sure that you are always aware of what your other choices are. Because once you know that you could quit, I knew that Bob was very popular on the team. And I also knew that Bob was very sensitive. And so part of me was afraid that if I told Bob in no uncertain terms that his work wasn't nearly good enough, that he would get upset. He might even start to cry. And then everyone would think I was the reason to become a manager is because you're interested in other people and helping them take a step in the direction of their dreams. And if that's not interesting to you, that's okay, but don't become a manager.
Welcome to the third episode of Growth Essentials. Before we get started, I just wanted to say a quick thank you for all of the early support that I've received. I'm super grateful for that and very excited for what's to come. So today I have invited Kim Scott, and Kim is an incredible woman with a crazy career journey. From studying arms control to then becoming a CEO coach to companies like Twitter, with lots of different steps in between. And then of course also writing her New York Times bestselling books, Radical Candor and Just Work. Kim is going to share some important career advice with you, and will of course also deep dive into the idea of Radical Candor and how you can build really great relationships, not just at work, but also in your personal life. So I hope you'll enjoy this one. I would say, let's kick it off. I'm Alina, and this is Growth Essentials, the podcast for your best self on things you wish you learned in school. Kim, super great to have you here with me today.
Great to be with you.
For the first part, I always like to go a bit back in time and ask my guests, how were your early days, your beginning, your upbringing? Maybe you can let us in a bit about that time of your life.
Sure, absolutely. So I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee in the U.S., and I studied arms control, actually, in college. I was very worried about the fate of the earth and the large number of nuclear weapons. And then the Berlin Wall fell in '89, my senior year in college, and it seemed like it was a very optimistic period in history. It seemed like so many of problems that had seemed intractable were being solved, and I moved to Moscow actually to study the peace dividend, the swords into plowshares. And I wound up working for the Soviet Companies Fund to raise money for these defense facilities that were converting to civilian production. So factories that had been making tanks were now making small tractors for newly privatized farms. This was in 1990, and it was an very interesting period, very different from the period we are living in right now. And then the firm I was working for decided the Soviet Union collapsed and our partner collapsed with it. And so the firm I was working for decided to reallocate the money to China, but I wanted to stay in Russia. And I wound up starting a diamond cutting factory, of all things, for another American firm. Yeah, it was very interesting. Through a friend of a friend, I got that job. And that was actually my first management job, and where I learned a really important management lesson, which was that the essence of being a good boss is to give a damn about the people who you work with. That was the one thing I had to offer that the state didn't have to offer. I tell that story in Radical Candor. And I did that for another couple of years, and then I went back to business school. And then after business school, I wound up working for the federal government, working at the Federal Communications Commission. I was definitely the only person in my business school class to do that. But I was very interested in the sort of telecom revolution and what it all meant. And about 1 year was all I could stand working in the in the government. It felt so slow. and the bureaucracy was sort of very hard for me. So then I wound up taking a job for an Israeli voice over IP company called Delta 3. And that was interesting and cool. But of course, my whole business career was really one giant plan to subsidize my novel writing habit. So in 1999, I had made enough money from that startup to take a year off and write a novel. So I did that, and never got published. But I self-published it. If you're curious, you can check it out. It's called The Measurement Problem. And then I ran out of money, and I wound up starting another, or helping a friend of mine start another company called Capital Thinking. And then in the course of starting that company, I had an idea for another company, which was called Juice Software, which I co-founded with some great people, some really interesting people, including Charles Ferguson, who went on to make movies. So all kinds of interesting people in my career. And after sort of Juice was doing really well for a while, and then we launched the software to Wall Street on September 10th, 2001, and September 11th, 2001 happened, and Juice limped along for a couple years after that, but we wound up selling it, sell being a very generous term for what actually happened. And then I wound up going to Google, and Google worked out a lot better than the previous failed startups for me. And after about 6 years at Google, I sort of realized the thing that I really cared about was not so much cost per click, although that was going really well at Google, but actually the opportunity to build great teams and to create a kind of environment, a kind of working environment where people could do the best work of their lives and enjoy working together. And not that I got it all right at Google or any place else, but that was the thing that really motivated me and the thing I wanted to really think about. But there wasn't a role at Google at the time where that could be my day job. I had to spend, 80% of my time thinking about cost per click and 20% of my time thinking about management. And meanwhile, a professor of mine from business school had left Harvard and joined Apple University. And he said, why don't you come? Steve Jobs wants to throw away all the management training that we have and start from a blank piece of paper. Why don't you come and help us do that? So I spent a couple of years at Apple, working with a great team of people, designing and teaching a class called Managing at Apple. And that was fun, great fun. But I also really wanted to go deeper on the management stuff. And so I wound up leaving Apple and helping another friend of mine from Google had become the CEO of Twitter, Dick Costolo. And he invited me to come be his CEO coach and to help him design a class called Managing at Twitter, which looked a lot like Managing at Apple. It turns out managing the core aspects of management don't really change from company to company. And that was really cool and really fun, but I wanted to make it scale. I wanted to extend it to everyone. And that was when I started writing Radical Candor and published that in 2017 and started a couple of different companies around the idea. One was a software company that didn't work, but the other one is a company that offers talks and workshops and really helps people to learn how to put the ideas into practice. Started that company with Jason Rosoff. And at the same time, I wanted to keep writing. And I got some feedback, and I can tell you more about that. But I got some feedback about Radical Candor, and that prompted me to write my next book, Just Work.
Crazy journey, honestly. Also quite funny because actually my parents have grown up in the eastern part of Berlin, so they have also experienced everything, and you've experienced it from the other side. So it's super crazy sometimes how it is. So Kim, let us break it down a bit again. Was there ever a belief that was created also within your childhood that then has impacted your adult life and the journey you've made afterwards?
Absolutely. When I was probably 6 years old, and my grandmother had chastised me for something. I had done something. I don't even remember what I did wrong, but I remember I was very upset that she had criticized me and I was crying. And she pulled me aside and she said, "Look, I told you this because I love you. And if you can learn how to listen to criticism and figure out if the other person is right and change things, that will make you a better person. That will make you more successful. Everything will go better if you can learn how to do that." And I can remember sitting there later, I don't know how much later, but thinking about what my grandmother had told me and realizing that she was right, that it wasn't such a disaster if I did something wrong. I was bound to do things wrong, but what was a disaster is not knowing what I was doing wrong.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, that has happened then probably quite early and like honestly impacted your career and the thing that you're doing right now a lot.
Yeah, huge impact.
Afterwards, after you actually founded Juice Software, right? You talked about this a bit. You joined Google afterwards. Like, what was the reason why you did not want to continue as of that moment to be a founder, but to go join another great company then in the end?
Whenever you make a change in life, you're going away from something and you're going towards something. And the experience at Juice was a great experience. I learned a lot, but ultimately it failed, and failure is exhausting. So I was burned out. I needed to go to a place where I could recover, frankly. I was really tired. So that's sort of what I was going away from. I did not have energy to start another company at that point. It was very, it's upsetting not for things not to work out. There's a Dutch phrase, I'm sure I'm not pronouncing it right, "Van je hele holen," someone told me at this period, and it means from your best efforts, nothing. And that was a discouraging place to be. So part of it was I needed to go to a place that felt like it had a little more safety and a little more resources for me to sort of recover. But the other reason why I went to Google was that when I actually wasn't at all sure I wanted to take the job at Google. I didn't fully understand what Google did at that point. Remember, this was quite early. I started interviewing in, I guess, when was it? 2003, I think I started interviewing. And it wasn't clear to anyone that Google would survive even. It wasn't clear that there was a lot of money in search. It's hard to remember. So a friend of mine, though, and also I was living in New York and I wasn't at all sure that I wanted to move to California. And a friend of mine said, just fly to California, go to the interviews and be present. And that, if you're ever not sure that you want to try something, that is really good advice. Just go and be present. And so I went there, not trying to judge anything, not trying to decide anything, but just trying to experience what it was like. And I remember getting there and the recruiting person was sort of walking me around the campus. And there's a volleyball field in the middle of, there was at the time, in the middle of the campus. There probably still, I know that one's still there, and there's probably one in the new campus as well. But the volleyball field was there. And a lot of startups at that time made a big deal of all this fun stuff they had, but nobody ever had time to do the fun stuff. They were all working so hard. But there in the middle of campus was a volleyball field, and Sergey Brin, one of the founders, was playing volleyball with a bunch of people. And I thought, oh, they're actually out there in the middle of the day playing volleyball. Like that made an impact on me. And I also found that the environment was very respectful. That they would allow me to bring my dog, like the kind of culture that I had wanted to create at Juice, at my own company, but I hadn't quite succeeded in creating. There was something I couldn't put words to it, but there was something sort of emotive that I felt just walking around the campus. I was like, oh, they've done it. They did what I wanted to do, not in terms of business, but in terms of culture. And so I think that was what brought me to Google. I was impressed with what they had done. And I continued to be impressed. After I got the offer letter, I throughout my whole career had been sort of consistently paid less than the men who were at my same level, who I worked with. And that was enraging, frankly, but I had kind of repressed how angry it made me feel because it was too distracting to be so mad all the time. And when I got my offer letter, I compared it with a friend of mine who I knew who was also applying at the same time, who was a man. And I was not paid less. It was the first time in my career where I was not just automatically paid less. And that made a really big impression. In that moment, I suddenly realized how much friction the sort of pay unfairness caused in my mind. And it kind of freed me up to really give my best to this organization and not to hold something back because I was pissed off about being underpaid.
You also experienced then quite early on that you actually wanted to be a leader and take responsibility for other people. Like, how did you discover that, right? Was there ever a situation where you found yourself, okay, I'm good at this could actually be like a great strength that I have to be a great leader? Like, how did that came about in your life?
Sure. Well, once again, there's kind of a moving towards and moving away. So what was I moving towards? Early in my career, when I was still working in Russia and starting up this diamond cutting factory, I had to hire some Russian diamond cutters. And I thought it was going to be easy because at that point the ruble was collapsing, the dollar was very strong in Russia, and I had just graduated from college. I'd studied Russian literature. I did not study business or anything like that. And I kind of had this, maybe simplistic idea about business. I was like, oh, the way you hire people is you pay them. It's really not that complicated. And so I went to these Russian diamond cutters and I said that I wanted to hire them. And I told them what the salary would be. And I thought that it would be a very short and easy conversation. But no, they still wanted to talk. They didn't just want money. They wanted to have a picnic. I was like, all right, well, I can do a picnic too. That's not so hard. And so we went out to have this picnic in the outskirts of Moscow. And there was the obligatory bottle of vodka. And by the time we had gotten to the bottom of the bottle of vodka, it was clear to me that what those people wanted, what those sort of craftspeople wanted, was not only money. They wanted a boss who gave a damn. They wanted to know that I would care enough about them and their families to get them out of Russia if things went sideways. And believe me, in the since Putin invaded Ukraine, I've been thinking a lot about those people and the other people who I worked with when I lived there, and talking to them. There are a lot of Russians who actually oppose the invasion. But anyway, that was kind of a moment for me when I realized that management is much more interesting than I understood. That if the purpose if part of a manager's job is to really get to know people and care about them at a human level, that's interesting. That's more interesting than making money by cutting and polishing diamonds, frankly. And so that was kind of what I was moving towards when I started my own company. But of course, I was also moving away from something. So what was I moving away from? Why did because being an entrepreneur is so much harder than taking a job. And so what was it that prompted me to do that? As I mentioned, throughout my career, I had so often been paid and less, and often significantly less. In fact, in one of my first jobs at the financial management company before the diamond cutting factory, I learned that I was being paid not, 25% less, but 25% of what the men were being paid. 1/4, I was being underpaid dramatically. And so I went to my boss and I said, this is not fair. And he said, well, you got to talk to the CEO of the company. There's nothing I can do. And I don't think he thought I would talk to the CEO of the company, but I did. I went to the CEO of the company and I said, this is ridiculous, being so dramatically underpaid. And he looked at me and he said, well, if I paid you that, and I was the only woman who was working for him. And I said, well, he said, well, if I paid you that much, you'd get paid more than my daughter. And his daughter was, I think, a kindergarten teacher, a first grade teacher. And I believe that kindergarten teachers and first grade teachers are also dramatically underpaid, and they should be paid way more than they are. But the answer to that problem is not to pay women in finance less than men in finance. The answer is to pay teachers more. And he just wasn't, but he didn't, I didn't even dare say that to him at the time. He was so angry with me, kind of yelling at me. And I was, right out of college, and I was intimidated by him. He successfully intimidated me into silence. But just because I was silent didn't mean I wasn't mad. I was furious. And as soon as I got the chance, I left that company and took a job at another company. And he actually was mad at me for leaving. I was like, for not being loyal to him. I'm like, what the hell did you give me to be loyal to? It's ridiculous. But anyway, so that happened. And one of the next jobs that I took, I decided I would take working for a woman because I was tired of getting underpaid. And I thought a woman wouldn't do that to me. And I brought in, she was an entrepreneur and she was building out her executive team. And I brought in a friend of mine to be on the team, to be one of my peers, someone I had known for a long time. And after he joined the company, he mentioned to me his salary. And lo and behold, he was getting paid a lot more than I was. It wasn't quite as bad as at the finance company, but he was getting paid, I don't know, 20 or 30% more than I was. And I went to her and I said, what gives? Why are you doing this? And she said, well, he has a wife and child to support. I was like, ah! And it was really at that moment, I decided the only way to make sure I get paid fairly is to be, to be the CEO, to be in control. And of course, I thought if I started my own company, and I was in charge, everything would be sweetness and light and there would be no injustice. And of course, that wasn't true either. I made some of the same mistakes managers who I had worked for had made. And that was like, those were really important lessons.
What advice do you actually have, especially to like younger women that listen to this, if such a situation happens, which still happens to this day, right? I know like crazy stories, but I mean, luckily you even had the courage to go up there. A lot of people don't. Like how, like what's your advice if something like that happens to you, to handle the situation?
Yeah, I think the first thing that I recommend is to build solidarity, to talk to other people around you, because it's so easy to get gaslit in those situations. And I did get, to a certain extent, I did get gaslit. When the CEO of the company is yelling at you, it's pretty intimidating. No matter how tough you are, Mm-hmm. And so I think the reason why I had courage to go and talk to him was that I had talked to a couple of other people at the company, a couple of the other partners at this finance company, and they agreed with me. They said, it's not fair. It's not right. And so building solidarity with other people. Also, there was a group of women who I knew, who were other expats in Moscow who were not working at the company, but who were working at other companies in similar roles. And we would have dinner 3 or 4 or 5 nights a week. And that was how I learned, actually, that I was getting underpaid. They told me about it. And they, at one point, I'll tell you another part of that. I mean, the story goes on and on. But at one point when I told my boss what one of my friends, who was a woman who had a similar role, was getting paid, his response was, oh, she must be sleeping with her boss. And I was like, it was but that's the kind of bullying that comes at you when people don't want to deal with the situation. And if I hadn't had that group of friends to go back and tell that story to, I might have felt I might have fallen for that kind of bullying, but they were the ones who reminded me this is complete BS. So build solidarity. Learn. There's a company actually called PayScale where you share your information and you learn about what the industry salaries are. There's a lot of different ways to make sure you're not underpaid. But PayScale's company, I just have been talking to recently and admire what they do. So figure out a way to build solidarity, to find out what's fair, what the market is. That's one thing I would say. The other thing I would say is locate the exit nearest you. Follow the advice that you get if you take a flight somewhere. And the other mistake I made, I think, at that finance company was that I hadn't explored other options. I didn't know whether or not I could get another job. I kind of felt trapped in the job where I was working. And sometimes we are trapped. And I want to acknowledge my privilege in that because I had financial resources, not huge financial resources, but I had some financial resources from my parents. And because I had gone to a university that made it easier to get other jobs, it was easier than I realized for me to get another job. And in fact, when I finally quit that working for the finance company and took another job for the diamond company, several people called me up and said, "Why didn't you tell me you were looking for a job? We would have hired you." And I was like, "Oh, I didn't know it would have been so easy." So make sure that you are always aware of what your other choices are, because once you know that you could quit, then it becomes much easier to go and give the feedback directly to the person who is underpaying you or saying biased things to you or bullying you. And it also makes it easier and safer to go to HR if you're working at a company that has an HR department. And often, I would say even HR will do the right thing. I also want to acknowledge that sometimes HR will do the wrong thing. Sometimes HR is working for your boss, not working for you. So you want to be aware of that. But it's much safer to begin to try to negotiate a solution to a problem that you're having at work if you know what your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. That's called a Batna. And anytime you have to negotiate anything, it's really good to be aware of what your Batna is, because if you know you have a good option, a good alternative, then it's safer to push harder.
That leads me out to another question, actually, because right now, especially what we also see with Generation Z, right, that they are switching companies much faster than people did a few years ago, which can be a good thing, right? Because you're acknowledging that maybe you're not happy. The culture is absolutely horrifying. But my question to you is, what advice do you have on whether we should stay or whether we should quit, and not quit too fast, in a sense, when you understand what I mean?
Yes. Well, first of all, I want to say that some of the best career advice I ever got was don't forget to quit. So it's okay I switch jobs pretty often, but also I think you're right to ask that question, because I think that sometimes we expect our career trajectory. We hope it'll go straight up like a rocket, the way that some people's, like in my case, Larry and Sergey's careers went straight up like a rocket. There was no slope. And so we hope that, but we expect that it'll be kind of this up and to the right trajectory. And that's not usually how things go in our career. It's usually more like a step function. And there are periods in our career where it doesn't feel like we're just sort of moving horizontally, and we're not moving we're not growing or getting the next big job or getting the next promotion or getting a salary increase, or it feels like we're not learning. And I would encourage folks to think about their careers kind of, if you have ever learned a foreign language, it goes like that too. It feels like you're not getting better, you're not getting better, you're not getting better. And then you wake up one morning and all of a sudden you understand things you couldn't understand before. And it's easy. And then it gets boring, and then it gets exciting because you all of a sudden improve. And so I would encourage people to think about whether the move that they're making, is it going to just keep them going like this, always horizontally, or is it a step? Is it going to help them grow? And also, I think it's good to be aware of when you're at a phase in your career when you want that growth. And there are other phases of your career where you don't want that growth. You want to invest your time and your energy in something outside of work. And so there are times in our careers when we're on a steep growth trajectory. There are other times in our careers when we're on a gradual growth trajectory. And that's okay. Don't fear the growth, but also don't fear that gradual growth trajectory. Remember that there are phases in every career.
Yeah.
And so sort of think about what you want, but also where you are in your growth phase, because you don't always, not every learning curve is super steep. Sometimes it's gradual, and it has to be.
No, totally. And I mean, it always also comes down back to the person's vision for their own life, right? Whether they want this or some people are not careerist, so to say, right? They don't want that, and that's also fine. And I think I took some time to acknowledge that that's okay too, actually, right?
Of course, there is nothing wrong with working to put food on the table and pay your rent. There's nothing, not everything has to be like some passion. Sometimes, like for me, my passion was really writing. And yet I couldn't make enough money as a writer early on in order to survive. And that's why I went to business school and why I took these roles as an executive leader. And I wanted to honor the jobs I was taking. I wanted to do a great job, and I wanted to put my whole self into those jobs and to use those to reflect who I wanted to be as a person in those jobs. So it's not like I didn't care about those jobs and I didn't do a great job, but a lot of my energy was often in developing my writing talent. And I think it worked out. It was okay.
I also want to talk a bit more about the topics of relationships. I mean, that's a huge topic in your book, Radical Candor, which is basically like focusing a lot about leadership and how we can be better leaders by caring personally and challenging directly. So maybe, you can quickly explain that concept again. And the question I have right after for you, because when I read it, I was not a leader myself, but it still added a lot of value to my own life. But I really thought about how applicable is this knowledge also to other areas of life.
So the idea of radical candor, and you're right, it doesn't apply only to being a boss. It applies to being an employee. It applies to being a peer. You can use it with your friends. You can use it with your romantic in your romantic life. So the idea of radical candor is that you want to care personally and challenge directly at the same time. And when you do both of those things at the same time, I call it radical candor. When you challenge, but you forget to show you care, I call that obnoxious aggression. In the first draft of the book, I called that being an asshole. But I stopped doing it for a really important reason. I stopped doing that because what I was doing is I was developing a really simple framework. So imagine a vertical line that's labeled care personally, a horizontal line that's labeled challenge directly. So now you have 4 quadrants. And the upper right-hand quadrant is radical candor. And the bottom right-hand quadrant is obnoxious aggression. And when I labeled that bottom right-hand quadrant as asshole, I found that people would use the framework to write names in boxes. And I beg of you, don't use this framework that way. This is not another Myers-Briggs personality test. This is not, these are not labels to attach to people. These are mistakes that we all make. So use this framework, use what I'm about to say to guide specific conversations with specific people to a better place. So sometimes we're obnoxiously aggressive. All of us make that mistake sometimes. And that's problematic. It's problematic because it harms the person who you were obnoxious to. It's also problematic because you're wasting your breath. When you act like a jerk, the other person usually goes into sort of fight or flight mode, and then they literally cannot hear what you're saying. So you're wasting your breath. And then there's a more subtle problem, which is, I think, for most people, when we realize, at least for me and for a lot of other people who I've talked to, when we realize that we've landed in that obnoxious aggression quadrant, it is our tendency, our instinct, not to go the right way on care personally to get back to radical candor. Instead, it's our instinct to go the wrong way on challenge directly. And then we wind up in the worst place of all, manipulative insincerity. And manipulative insincerity, if obnoxious aggression is front stabbing, manipulative insincerity is backstabbing. And manipulative insincerity is sort of where passive aggressive behavior, political behavior, all of the kinds of things that make a workplace really toxic creep in, as does obnoxious aggression. And when we talk about things going wrong at work, we often talk about obnoxious aggression and manipulative insincerity because that's where the drama is. But the fact of the matter is the vast majority of us make the vast majority of our mistakes in this last quadrant where we remember to show that we care personally. It turns out most people are actually pretty nice people. So we remember to show that we care personally, but we fail to tell someone something they'd be better off knowing in the long run. And that I call ruinous empathy.
And because you also just said, right, it's also applicable to other areas of life, especially with the ones who are closer to us. Like I imagine, I mean, we care even more probably, right? Because we see them every day. They're like really close to us. So, so the caring part is there. So, you know, and then we actually do also need to talk about things that maybe are wrong, and we need to challenge them directly. And now we're of course afraid to maybe be disliked. We're also afraid to hurt the other person. So how do we go about that challenging directly part?
It's different for everyone. So I'm not going to give you any absolute answers, but I'll share some things that have worked for me. One of the things that really works for me is to think about a time when I failed to be radically candid and it hurt the person worse in the long run. So remembering that the reason that you're challenging directly is to improve the relationship and to help the other person. So then it becomes much easier. So I have a work story and a personal story. You ready? You want work first or personal first?
Go for work and then we do personal.
Okay. I one time had hired this person. We'll call him Bob. And I really liked Bob a lot. He was smart. He was charming. He was funny. He would do stuff like we were at a manager offsite and we were playing one of those endless get to know you games. And it was a startup. And everyone was stressed out. And Bob was the guy who had the courage to raise his hand and to say, I have an idea and it'll help us get to know each other and it'll be really fast. I can tell we're all stressed and want to get back to work. So let's just do this. Whatever his idea was, we were down with it. He says, let's just go around the table and confess what candy our parents used when potty training us. Really weird, but really fast. Weirder yet, for the next 10 months, every time there was a tense moment in a meeting, Bob would whip out just the right piece of candy for the right person at the right moment. So Bob brought a little levity to the office. Everybody loved working with Bob. There was one problem with Bob. He was doing terrible work. I was so puzzled. I couldn't understand what was going on because he would hand stuff in to me. There was shame in his eyes. He knew his work wasn't nearly good enough. And yet he had this great resume, this great history of accomplishments. I learned much later the problem was that Bob was smoking marijuana in the bathroom 3 times a day, which maybe explained all that candy that he always had at all times. But I didn't know any of that at the time. All I knew was that Bob was doing terrible work. And so I would say something to Bob along the lines of, "Oh, Bob, this is a great start. You're so smart. You're so awesome. Everybody loves working with you. Maybe you can make it a little bit better," which, of course, he never did. So let's pause for a moment. Why did I say something so banal to Bob? I think that part of the problem was that I was being ruinously empathetic. I really liked Bob, and I really didn't want to hurt his feelings. But if I'm honest with myself, there was something also a little bit more insidious going on, because I knew that Bob was very popular on the team. And I also knew that Bob was very sensitive. And so part of me was afraid that if I told Bob in no uncertain terms that his work wasn't nearly good enough, that he would get upset. He might even start to cry. And then everyone would think I was a big you-know-what. And so the part of me that was concerned about Bob's feelings, that was the ruinous empathy part. The part of me that was worried about my reputation as a leader, that was the manipulative insincerity part. And this goes on for 10 months. And eventually the inevitable happened. And I realized that if I didn't fire Bob, I was going to lose all my best performers. Because not only had I been unfair to Bob by not telling him, because I wasn't giving him an opportunity to correct, I had been unfair to the whole team. And the people who were the best performers were really frustrated because they weren't able to do their best work in this environment. Their deliverables were late because his deliverables were late. They weren't able to spend as much time as they wanted to on their work because they were always having to redo his work. And it wasn't fair to them, and they were frustrated. They were going to leave and go to someplace where they could do their best work. So I sat down to have a conversation with Bob that I should have started, frankly, 10 months previously. And when I finished explaining to him where things stood, he kind of pushed his chair back from the desk. He looked me right in the eye, and he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And as that question was going around in my head with no good answer, he said, "Why didn't anyone tell me? I thought you all cared about me." And now I realized that by not telling Bob, and I thought I was just being nice by not telling him because I didn't want to hurt his feelings, but by not telling Bob, I'm now having to fire him as a result of it. Not so nice after all. But it was too late to save Bob. Even Bob agreed that he should go at this point. His reputation on the team was shot. All I could do in the moment was make myself a very solemn promise that I would never make that mistake again, and that I would do everything in my power to help other people avoid making that mistake. Because frankly, it's the most common mistake that managers make. It happens every day, everywhere. And that's really why I'm talking to you, why I wrote the book, why I came up with that simple framework to think about this problem.
What about the personal story?
All right, the personal story. At one point in my life, I had roommates. And there was one roommate who I just didn't like much. I didn't get along with her. But I didn't want to be mean and tell her that she couldn't keep living with us, or tell her even that I had some problems, which maybe she could have addressed. Maybe it was some of the stuff was behavioral. So I didn't say anything to her, and we renewed 1 year. We renewed a second year, and finally, after she'd been living with us for years, for like 3 years, then we all said, "We don't want to live with you anymore." And it was way more painful to hear this. She thought we were her good friends, and we were not her good friends. And we had not confessed this to her soon enough. So what would have been a little painful at the end of the first year became enormously more painful by waiting. And it is really hard. It's much harder in these kinds of personal situations, I think, even than at work. But we were not being kind to her to pretend that everything was okay. It wasn't okay. Either she could have changed if we had talked to her sooner, or she could have left and found better friends than we were.
In those challenging situations, how do we go about the thing of of not offending someone personally. So you also talk about this where we're not supposed to say don't take it personal, right? How do we really like accelerate that communication where we're not saying you are this or you are that, and really making it super, super personal and even harder for this person to receive the feedback that we're giving them?
I think one thing that can help is something we call CORE: context, observation, result, next steps. So, for example, I had a boss who told me in the meeting, when you said every third word, it made you sound stupid. And believe me, that was hard to hear at the time. But she said it in such a way. First of all, she said it more gently a couple of times, and I brushed it off. And then when she said it to me that way, I finally did understand that I needed to take action. But there's a world of difference between giving someone the context, stating the observation about something they can change, showing the result so they know why they want to change, and suggesting a next step. I know this speech coach you could go and it would. And so thinking about talking to someone in those terms. In the meeting, when you said every third word, it made you sound stupid. It's very different from saying you're stupid. So you don't want to ever give people critical feedback about their personality attributes, because those are things that are very hard to change. You want to give them feedback about things that they can change. And they may decide they don't want to change those things. But, if you're going to get along with me, then here's something about me that's not going to change. And either we need, you need to adapt to it, or we need to part ways. And that's okay to do in your personal life. And it's okay to do at work as well. I mean, you cannot, radical candor is not some sort of secret elixir that will allow you to have a positive relationship with anyone. There are some people who you just can't have, you shouldn't be in a relationship with. And the sooner you both know that, the better, because you can both move on. It doesn't mean that you're right or they're right. It just means it's not going to work.
I was also thinking of this because I know that you're also a big fan of being radical candid with yourself, especially.
Yes.
So actually, right, in all areas of life, this can be applicable. Like we should like be radical candid with ourselves. Sometimes, though, what I also noticed with myself, if I'm candid with myself, I lose my the self-compassion towards myself. I get in this road, okay, like you didn't do this well, and you're like, all of a sudden you're crushing yourself. So how can we actually, at that part, bring the caring personal part up again and actually care about ourselves and be nice to ourselves to receive that feedback in a way that we can,
There's a wonderful book that Carol Dweck wrote called Mindset. And I think the important thing to being radically candid instead of obnoxiously aggressive with yourself is to adopt a growth mindset. And so if your goal is to become your best self and to get better at certain skills, but also to be your best self, you've got to take steps to get there. None of us are born able to live up to our ideals. We don't even have ideals when we're born. So at a certain point, you develop these ideals about who you are, who you want to be, and have a growth mindset about. So when you fail to be that person, to act in a way that person would act, you want to know about it, because you can't do right if you can't admit when you're doing wrong. So an example of this for me came shortly after Radical Candor was published. I was giving a Radical Candor talk at a tech company in San Francisco, and the CEO of that company had been a colleague of mine for the better part of a decade, and is a person who I like and respect enormously, and who is also one of too few Black women CEOs in tech. And after I gave the Radical Candor talk, she pulled me aside and she said, "Kim, I'm excited to roll out Radical Candor. I think it's going to help me build the kind of culture I want here. But I got to tell you, it's much harder for me to roll it out than it is for you." And she went on to explain to me that as soon as she would offer even the most gentle, compassionate criticism to people, she would get slimed with the angry Black woman stereotype. And I knew this was true. This was some feedback for me. And as soon as she said it, I had sort of 4 revelations at the same time. The first one was that I had failed to be the kind of colleague that I aspired to be, that I imagined myself to be. I had failed to be an upstander for her. I had failed even to notice the extent to which she had to show up unfailingly cheerful and pleasant in every meeting we were ever in together, even though I knew in that period of time she had what to be ticked off about at work, as we all do. And so I hadn't lived up to who I want to be in my relationship with her. The second thing I realized was that I had been in denial about the kinds of things that happened to me as a woman in the workplace, as a white woman in the workplace. And I think I had been in denial because I never wanted to think of myself as a victim. But even less than wanting to think of myself as a victim, did I want to think of myself as a perpetrator. And so I had probably been deepest in denial about the kinds of things that I had done wrong. I had done that. I never meant to harm the people who I worked with, but I had harmed them sometimes. And I'd been in denial about that. And then the fourth thing I realized was that I hadn't always managed to create the kinds of working environments in which everyone could just work, just in the justice sense of the word, but also in the just get stuff done sense of the word. And that moment of feedback that my colleague gave me prompted me to write my whole next book, Just Work, in which I try to tease out and disambiguate bias, prejudice, and bullying so that we can know what to say, so that we can be better upstanders, but also when they're directed at us so that we can know what to say.
I think oftentimes we care a lot more about being heard than we actually listen to really what's in front of us in order to then be able to also react and be a good partner, be a good friend, be a good colleague. So what's your advice on actually being a better listener?
Yeah. So I think that one of the things that can help, very often we say assume good intent. And I think when you're the listener, that's really good advice. Like assume good intent, assume this person is not trying to hurt you. Listen, even if what they're telling you is not delivered especially well, there may be some wheat, but there's a lot of chaff in there. Separate the wheat from the chaff and focus on the wheat. That's when you're listening. But when you are talking, when you're the one who's giving the radical candor, do not insist that other people assume good intent of you. If you're harming them, if you're upsetting them, maybe you haven't intended to be obnoxiously aggressive, but you have been, that's when you need to adjust. And so if the other person, when you're the listener, try to look for, you're like panning for gold in what they're saying. Maybe there's a lot of dirt, a lot of rocks, a lot of nonsense, but pan for the gold when you're the listener. But when you're the speaker, you want to pay attention to how the other person is responding and adjust. So if the other person seems sad or mad, move up on the care personally dimension. If the other person is kind of brushing you off, move out on the challenge directly dimension on the radical candor framework.
You are saying like if you're a good leader, right, you can guide people to be a better version of themselves, and you can also guide them in a sense that you understand where they are right now and where they maybe want to go, right? And like, are we better friends and partners if we actually like really understand better where people want to go, so we're like able to provide them with more feedback or advice, help, or is this really something that, goes too deep and should rather be something that we do like as leaders in the work environment?
Well, I think, at least for me, in my personal relationships, I want those to be deeper relationships even than my work relationships. So I do think it is really important, and I think it comes more naturally in personal relationships to sort of have these get-to-know-you conversations and to understand a person's path through life and what really is important to them, what motivates them, what their core values are in life. I think if you're gonna if you're going to be friends with someone, or if you're going to be a life partner to someone or a parent to someone, it's really important to understand what motivates that other person and not to assume that what motivates you motivates them. So I think those, the understanding a person, it's also just interesting. I mean, you get to know, usually the more you know, the more you like about, I mean, there are exceptions to that. And if the more you know, the less you like, that's a sign that you should not be having a relationship with that person. But usually I find in my personal relationships, certainly, even my husband, who I've been married to for 15 years, and we take a walk together every day, and we have breakfast and dinner together almost every night. Like, I spend a lot of time with him, but I still am learning new things about his past all the time. So I think that it's important to understand a person's past. And it's also important to understand where someone wants to go in the future. Like, what are their dreams for the future? And especially in your intimate relationships, because sometimes you realize as you talk about dreams of the future that you're going to go in different directions, and that's okay. But it's the sooner you know that, the better. And so I think it's even more important to do this in your personal relationships than at work. But I think it also, at least for me, it comes more naturally. It came more naturally for me to do that in my personal relationships than it did. It felt at first when I was at work, it felt like those kinds of conversations were maybe extracurricular. And I realized that having career conversations with my direct reports was actually part of my job. And in fact, it was my favorite part of my job. So that's like the reason to become a manager, is because you're interested in other people and helping them take a step in the direction of their dreams. And if that's not interesting to you, that's okay, but don't become a manager.
Yeah, totally. I absolutely agree. One follow-up question to that regards: how do you make sure, even if you're in such a long relationship, to make time to talk about exactly that? What's your vision and dreams for like the next, few years? So you actually make sure that you have enough time to talk about these things.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's more, I don't have career conversations with my husband, and he doesn't have career conversations with me. Of course. But so I think if you're working with someone and you're someone's boss, you want to actually have kind of a process where you do this once a year. But with what and everybody has a different kind of recipe for what keeps them centered. But one of the things that's really important for me and for my husband and for our kids is that we have breakfast and dinner together. I mean, sometimes I travel, sometimes I'm not around. Like the other day I was on a work call and I missed dinner. So it's not, it's not totally rigid, but I would say, sort of 9 nights out of 10, we have dinner together as a family. And then once a week, so maybe it's not 9 out of 10. Once a week, my husband and I try to have date night. It was easier when we could go to restaurants. We're still not eating at restaurants because of COVID. So we don't have date night as often now, but we do, now that we're both working at home, we do take a walk together almost every day. And so just making sure you have, probably 20 minutes for your most intimate relationships. You want to make sure you have at least 20 minutes a day where you're just talking, where you're just, you're not watching a movie together, but where you're just talking. So like with my son, that happens right before he goes to sleep. And with my daughter, it happens at I have to grab her. It's harder to get her to, but I make sure that we're talking a little. We have a little bit of time to talk. And also we have a rule at the table when we're eating breakfast or dinner. Like, that is not a time to criticize each other. That is not a time to discuss problems. That's a time where we're having conversation and enjoying each other. And if we need additional time to resolve conflict, we'll take that. But the dinner table needs to be kind of like a safe place.
Super nice. Thank you so much for sharing, Kim. I have like 3 quick fire questions that I'll do really, really fast.
Okay.
If you could tell your past self one thing, what would it be?
It would be, don't forget to quit. I wish I had learned that earlier.
If you could learn one skill instantly, what would it be?
It would probably be a new language. I would like to be able to speak Chinese, for example.
That's cool. I like that.
Or code. Maybe the language would be code. I wish that I had studied computer science.
Okay. And for the last one, of course, I have to ask you this. What's your like best book you've read, your favorite one?
Middlemarch by George Eliot is my favorite. I think it's one of the great novels of all time. But second close is Anna Karenina.
I super much enjoyed the conversation with you. Thank you so much for, sharing your insights and your experience with us. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, and good luck on your journey. I'm excited about your podcast and honored that you invited me.
Thank you so much, Kim.
Take care.
Thank you so much for watching this episode. I truly hope that you have enjoyed it. If you did, I linked another one right here for you to check out. I hope you'll love this one as well, and I'll see you very soon in the new and next episode.